In a mountain valley where timber stands so tight it erases noon, a dirt road ends at a house people prefer to forget. Locals call the region Blackwater for the creek that runs dark over ironstone and spruce needles, and for the way stories sink there. Before we reveal the unsettling reality, please press the bell, subscribe, and leave a comment below about your current situation. On a March morning of thaw and fog, a sheriff and 2 deputies rode that road carrying a folded warrant and a weight they could not name. The house waited with shutters closed and a wide chimney. 2 pale figures stood on the porch, smiling the same careful smile as if expecting an appointment. Sheriff Calvin Red unfolded the paper and read the lines aloud. The twins listened without blinking. When he finished, Amos Vale said thank you, and Lena Vale echoed him, the words arriving with the same unhurried tone. They stepped aside together and opened the door together. Inside, the hall smelled like carbolic and damp wood. Locks shone on interior doors that never needed locks before. Blankets were nailed over upstairs windows to keep light from entering or leaving. The deputies exchanged a look that did not need translation. Whatever lived inside this house had been taught to live without witnesses. Ephraim Vale had built the place with squared timbers and a porch deep enough for summer rain. He bought 200 acres along Blackwater Creek in 1891, after a season driving logs and healing a cough the valley knocked loose. He married Agnes Quinn, who died birthing twins in 1889 while snow lay heavy on the spruce. He named the children Lena and Amos and promised the graveside that he would be mother and father both. The nearest town, Blackwater Crossing, was a church bell, a mercantile, a doctor with steady hands, and a muddy street that swallowed wagon wheels. After town, children mocked Lena's milk-white skin in 1897. Ephraim kept them home. He told himself the woods would teach more kindly than people. The twins learned each other faster than they learned letters. They made a language of gestures and breath. One lifted a tool and the other had already stepped aside. One coughed near the stove and the other poured water without being asked. Ephraim tried to believe this was merely closeness, the sort that happens when a world is small. He could read weather and water, but he could not read what grew behind upstairs doors. By 18, the house had habits he did not remember starting. Hasps gleamed on doors. Blankets were nailed across windows, though summer baked the eaves. The cellar steps were braced and the packed floor sloped new. His father's odd books vanished from the parlor shelf and reappeared in the attic. Pamphlets on lineage, crude treatises on heredity, livestock manuals annotated in pencil. He asked for the books back. Amos said they were studying. Lena said they were learning how families stay strong. When he asked why they whispered at night, they smiled as if he had interrupted their private conversation. In April 1909, the merchant at Caldwell's asked if the muslin had arrived in time for the wedding. The question scorched Ephraim's throat. He rode home hard, called the twins into the parlor, and demanded names. They came down hand in hand. Amos said they were marrying. Lena said to each other. Ephraim answered with scripture, law, and the oldest facts of the body. They listened as if grading his recitation. Amos slid a braided horsehair loop onto his sister's finger. They moved into the master bedroom that night. Ephraim drank alone and slept in his boots by accident often. After the declaration, the house hardened. New hardware sprouted. The cellar breathed heavier. At Caldwell's, identical signatures paid cash for lime, rope, jars, flour, liniments, carbolic, and fresh boards. The ledger recorded dates, tongues recorded nothing. Outback soil was disturbed in tidy rectangles and tamped. In June 1910, thunder sat over the valley and Lena labored behind a barred door. Hours later, Amos allowed a look. The girl had extra fingers, a skewed skull, and eyes that slid off faces. Lena called her perfect. Amos wrote in a small book and smiled at the page instead of her softly. In February 1911, a son was born, strong and ordinary. The twins seemed disappointed. Amos murmured baseline and set him aside like a tool that did not fit. In August 1912, another daughter arrived, breath-catching like paper in a draft. The notebooks multiplied, names disappeared. The children became special, regression improved. Ephraim began sleeping with his bedroom door locked and woke to sounds he explained as the house settling until he could not. A hunter named Orrin Maddox noticed smoke at 3 a.m. and lanterns moving at hours families sleep. Curiosity turned into the kind that hunts. He visited with venison and manners. The twins poured coffee and asked after his hounds. Their smiles were careful lids. He excused himself, took a wrong turn on purpose, and paused outside a locked door where a child was crying through wood, distance, and the way a voice tires when no answer comes. When he mentioned it, both smiles stopped together. "Old houses make old sounds," Amos said. "The wind is tricky here," Lena said. Orrin left with every hair on his arms lifted. He returned at dawn and pressed an eye to a half-covered basement window and saw. Small rooms ran along a wall. Each held a rush mat, a bowl, and a slit too narrow for a head to pass. Straw was crushed into ovals where bodies had learned not to move far. Shadows moved with bowls and blankets. The sound inside was unmistakable. He crawled backward and did not run because running makes noise. He meant to tell the sheriff. He never did. His rifle was found against a pine less than a mile away. His dogs returned days later, pads torn and ribs counting themselves. The twins joined the search with lanterns and steady voices. Dr. Marion LeClaire kept a small surgery in Blackwater Crossing and a ledger that balanced births against visits. Her notes told a truth the county book did not. She had treated Lena enough times to expect more infants than were ever registered. She rode to the lodge with the ordinary excuse of postnatal examinations. Doors were locked. The air smelled of carbolic. Voices said the children were resting and would wake later. She returned at different hours and saw buckets carried down and linens carried up. During a thaw, she watched a shovel, a bundle, and careful smoothing of soil. She told the pastor's wife she would fetch the sheriff after one last look so he could not call it gossip. She never reached the office. A teamster found her trap with the horses hitched and panting, instruments spilled from a fallen bag like bones and tracks melting into mud. The valley swallowed the rest. Letters began to collect on the sheriff's desk like leaves in a corner. Families asked after a hunter, a doctor, and a surveyor who had not returned. Merchants refused deliveries past the half-mile post. The county commissioner began using the word negligence in letters. Calvin Red had avoided the lodge for 7 years because some stones are easier not to overturn. Now stones were being thrown from the Capitol. He applied for a warrant for suspicion of unlawful imprisonment linked to disappearances and rode up the Blackwater Road with 2 deputies, a county clerk, and the feeling that comes before a bad truth. The twins stood waiting on the porch, pale and polite, as if relieved the world had language for their world. They opened the door and the law entered a house that trained itself to be a glove for secrets at last. The downstairs hall smelled of damp wood and something sharp. Locks glittered. Drawings covered upstairs walls, family trees in pencil, rough anatomy studies, charts with dates and measures. A desk held notebooks labeled by year and letters. Essie stood where names should sit. The language was tidy and wrong. A bedroom for 2 stood neat as a photograph. The sheriff called for keys. None fit the door he wanted. He told a deputy to fetch a crowbar. The cellar door complained once, then yielded. Cold air exhaled. The lanterns wobbled. The stairs fell away into a tunnel dark below them. Ephraim lay under the roof peak, thin as a shadow. He was not tied. He was corralled by a body that had stopped obeying. He blinked at faces he half remembered and asked without moving whether the cellar door was latched. The deputy said it was open now. Ephraim closed his eyes. On the rafters above his pallet, hatch marks marched by fives across the beams. He had been counting something days do not willingly surrender. The sheriff said he would be moved to care that day. The old man whispered that the house talked in numbers to avoid names. In town, before anyone knew what would be carried out, a bell rang without service because the pastor's hands needed work. People gathered and then drifted toward the road and then turned back again because fear and curiosity pull in different directions. Children were told to keep away and walked as far as the bend to watch dust. The clerk from the county office unpacked fresh paper and a pencil sharpened to a knife point. He would copy what notebooks said without letting the language deform his hand. The sheriff wiped his boots and started down the cellar stairs carefully. The smell met them first, old air mixed with damp wood and a sharp chemical thread. Lantern light fell in uncertain sheets. The passage was the width of a man. Planks formed a continuous wall pierced high by narrow cutouts. Rings were sunk into joists, and grooves showed where ties had rubbed the grain. In the first stall, a thin boy sat with his knees to his chest, eyes fixed somewhere past the lanterns. He flinched at moving air more than sound. A deputy crouched and spoke softly. The boy watched the key, not the hand, as the lock turned. In the second stall, a little girl crouched with her hands over her ears. The skin at her wrists was scabbed where rope had lived. When the lantern lifted, she covered her face with her forearm and sobbed without tears. The deputy lowered the light and clicked his tongue softly, a stable habit that works on frightened things. She stilled because sound meant instruction in this room. In the third stall there was only straw, a smell like old sickness, and hundreds of hatch marks scored into the wood in groups of 5, the last line broken before it finished. They did not lift the blanket in the fourth. A deputy touched the wall and withdrew his hand as if the board itself had a pulse. The sheriff's voice, when it came, was small and flat. He called the twins down. They stood at the bottom step watching like hosts, gauging late-arriving guests. When he asked who built the stalls, Amos said a cellar needs structure in a wet climate. When he asked why rings were fixed in joists, Lena said storms demand securing. When he asked about the children, she corrected his word and said, subject, not child. The clerk found a ring of keys near the kitchen and brought them like medicine. Some fit, some did not. The first stall opened. The boy flinched at air and allowed his arm to be taken because bodies learn the cost of resistance. They wrapped him in a coat. The girl came one step at a time, testing the threshold with her palm, then the floorboards with her fingers as if mapping a path back to the corner if courage failed. Above them, blankets smothered windows. Behind them, the door hunched open. Before them, the cellar waited to be emptied. The cellar exhaled a breath that did not belong to morning, and the men learned to move like people entering a sick room, every footstep placed, every word weighed. They opened each stall the way a letter is opened when the envelope might contain bad news. The boy came first, light as a bundle of sticks. The girl followed, one hand on the jamb, testing the existence of thresholds. Upstairs, a third child sat on a cot under a sliver of light and covered her face when footsteps entered, the way a bird hides its head beneath a wing. The sheriff told his men to bring blankets and told his own hands not to shake. Amos and Lena stood very still, as though motion belonged to other people. He ordered them apart and posted a deputy between rooms. When they started tapping a rhythm on the walls, he knocked once himself and said, "Enough." They were polite when he shackled them, polite when he read the charge, polite when he told them they would wait. He had never hated politeness before. The clerk found a ring of keys in a drawer beside the kitchen stove and brought them with the ceremony of a man carrying medicine. Some fit the crude latches, some did not. The locks that failed yielded to a crowbar and patience. Every time a door opened, the air changed shape, as if the room itself had been holding its breath. They carried the children upstairs, wrapped in coats, moving them slowly through the new geography of hallways and stairs. The boy rocked in short, practiced arcs and stared past the banister toward a corner only he could see. The younger girl learned the pattern of boards and paused at each change of grain to memorize it with her fingertips. The oldest clutched a sleeve and breathed when told to breathe. Red sent a deputy for the county doctor and any woman in town who had ever coaxed a child through a fevered night. Blankets, milk, broth, clean rags. He wrote the words on a scrap and handed it to the clerk, who ran as if ink could sour if it sat too long. He sat Amos at the kitchen table and pushed one of the notebooks across the wood. "Explain these letters," he said. Amos replied that letters kept sentiment out of the ledger. Red answered that names are not sentiment. They are the only fence most people ever have. While the doctor rode, the deputies searched. In a box under oiled tools, they found a fixed blade knife with a bone handle scorched along the grip. Orrin Maddox owned a knife like that. Under folded linen, they found a leather doctor's bag, brass latch rubbed smooth, initials ML worked into the handle. The instruments inside had been cleaned and wiped with oil. The smell of tincture clung to the seams. Red shut the bag and did not speak for a long breath. Dr. Marion Leclerc arrived with hair-escaping pins and the calm a crisis trusts. She went from child to child, counting pulse, testing swallow, warming blankets on the stove before wrapping them tight. Offer water by the spoon, never the dipper. Sweeten it a little. Keep the room warm. No bright light, no sudden doors, she said, and people obeyed because instruction can be a kind of mercy. Women from town brought quilts and broth. Men lifted without looking too hard. The twins watched while their world was carried past them, curious as if studying a demonstration. When Red said the word arrest, Amos nodded as though the moment satisfied a schedule. Lena asked whether the subjects would be kept together for observation. "They will be kept alive," Red answered. Ephraim was carried from the attic on a pallet and set in the light of the front room. He asked once more if the cellar door was latched, then dozed and woke and asked again. When told it stood open, he closed his eyes and let a breath go that must have been held for years. On the rafters above him, the hatch marks kept counting even with no hand to make more. The sheriff sent riders to prepare rooms at the mining infirmary 1 county west, a place with a north window and steady light. The children would go when they could bear motion. Until then, the lodge became half sick room, half evidence chest. Red directed the deputies to sack the notebooks, tag the knife in the bag, and leave the cellar as they found it until the attorney laid eyes on it. By afternoon, the yard filled with people who had not wanted to come, and now could not quite make themselves leave. They stood with hats crushed in their hands, whispering to each other the way folks do at a funeral when language is smaller than feeling. A child tapped twice on a fence rail and his mother moved his hand to her lap without scolding. At dusk, the twins rode to the jail in separate wagons, each with a deputy and an empty space where the other used to be. They sat on their benches with hands folded and asked for paper to reconstruct protocols while memory was fresh. Red gave them none. He set a chair between cells and read from their own pages until his voice steadied. When he reached the line that called a death non-viable, he closed the book and looked at the wall rather than their faces. The county attorney arrived with a pencil and a stare and built the case the way a scaffold is built, plank by plank. Caldwell from the Mercantile read entries from his ledger until dates and quantities turned from gossip to shape. A surveyor described new hinges, extra boards, and a bulkhead added to the cellar in 1912. The pastor's wife repeated the doctor's last sentence about one more look before fetching the sheriff. Taken alone, each fact wobbled. Taken together, they held. Reporters came with stiff collars and better hats and wrote about a mountain experiment because the phrase fit neatly in a headline. Red refused to release the notebooks and told them to print the weather. He would not have the word deprivation sitting in parlors chewed wrong. Within days, a judge ordered the trial moved to the county seat 50 miles north, away from a jury pool already leaning under rumor. The sheriff agreed. Clean air helps a verdict breathe. The twins traveled by rail in a guarded car, seated on opposite benches so they could not arrange their pauses. On the platform, people craned for a look. The twins stared past them toward a distance only they recognized. Ephraim gave a deposition at the asylum because the doctor doubted his mind would hold for court. He told the story of a road that turned into a wall while he was still calling it home. When asked when he first understood, he said it was when they stopped saying she and he and started saying it. And when the letters came, he knew it was too late. The children were moved once they could bear motion. The infirmary staff gave them a north room where the light did not swing like a door. The smallest arranged her bedding into a grid and slept only when the lines were neat. The nurses let her keep it that way. The boy learned cup and used it like magic. The oldest blinked more often and flinched a little less. At night, Red sat at his desk between the two cells and read until the quiet stopped sounding like complicity. He forbade knocking. When one of them rapped a knuckle out of habit, he tapped the bars with his pencil and said, "No more." They slept. He did not. The county attorney prepared for the only defense he feared, the neat claim that isolation had unwound judgment until wrong no longer registered as wrong. He wrote in his notebook, not delusional, deliberate, not hallucinating, observing, not compelled, choosing, and underlined each pair until the paper thinned. Spring kept working on the valley while the case gathered its own weather. Snow retreated from the north faces. Sap rose quietly in the cut stumps. The creek went brown and loud. People returned to fields and mills with the same bent posture they carried to funerals, half bowed to work and half to thought. Searchers kept digging where Red had set stones. They found lime melted to chalk in places where the soil refused the spade, but no bones with names. Absence can testify if you let it. The sheriff boxed a buckle, a scrap of canvas with saddle stitching, and a button, and wrote nothing on the labels yet. On Sundays, the church bell rang again, this time on purpose. The pastor did not preach about monsters. He said a door may look like wood and be called love and still be a prison. If you hear a child on the other side, you knock. In the county seat, the judge began the hearings with a dry throat and a watch he wound twice. Lawyers argued venue, then sanity, then language. The defense called a doctor who spoke about shared delusion, about mirrored minds. The attorney let him talk, then handed him a notebook and asked him to read the entry that called a death, a termination, and a child non-viable. The doctor lowered his eyes and said nothing else useful. The twins answered questions with the same trimmed patience they had shown on the porch. "Why rings in the joists?" asked the attorney. "Storms," said Lena. "Why the boards?" asked the judge. "To manage light," said Amos. "Why notes about deprivation? To test limits. Why letters instead of names? To prevent attachment. Why did a child die? Not every line breeds true." In the infirmary, the smallest learned to sleep without the quilt tent, and the boy laughed once at a nurse's squeaking shoes. The oldest discovered the window could be looked at and not feared. She stood beside it with her palm on the wall and watched a cloud move as slowly as a thought. The attorney drafted his closing while Rain worked on the courthouse eaves. He would say that vocabulary is not a veil, that letters do not erase blood, that a cellar built to hold children is not a cellar but a plan. He would say that isolation is not absolution, and that politeness can be a mask for intention. He would ask the jurors to picture the stall with the marks that did not finish and decide whether the law should. Back in Blackwater Crossing, people fixed their fences and sharpened their saws and spoke more gently to children. A woman who had never raised her voice in public stood after Sunday supper and told her family that if they ever heard a child where no child should be, they were to knock until someone opened. A man at the mill said a house is only a house until the doors are used against you. Red visited the lodge one last time before the trial, stood in the cellar doorway and put his palm against the post where the rings had been. He kept 2 iron hoops in a box to remind himself that memory prefers to blur, and that the job was to keep edges. He did not pray. He said a sentence aloud to the empty room, the same one he meant to say to the jurors. A name is a fence, and fences save lives. When he turned away, a draft moved the lantern flame and sent a ripple through the dark that made the space look briefly alive, like something had breathed and settled. He closed the door and let the hinges complain because some noises deserved to be heard. Outside, Blackwater Creek talked and the valley listened. Night gathered over Blackwater slowly. Tomorrow, trial. The courthouse in the county seat had a clock that ran a little fast, as if it could not wait to see how the day would turn. People filed in with the hush reserved for funerals and weddings where words are binding and not easily taken back. The judge took his seat with a hand on the gavel as if it were a cane. The twins were led to the defense table and sat with their backs straight and their hands folded, polite as guests. They wore prison gray that swallowed the paleness of their skin and made their eyes look like a winter river. They did not look for each other because they had been taught not to in the weeks since the cellar door opened, but the angle of their heads matched by habit. The attorney for the state spoke first, not with thunder but with weight. He told the jurors he would give them a house, room by room, a cellar, stall by stall, a book, line by line. He promised them nothing they had not already earned by listening so hard their necks would ache. He called Sheriff Red and stepped aside. Red walked to the witness chair with a gait that belonged to a man who had climbed grades steeper than this. He told them about the porch and the careful smiles, the smell of carbolic in the hall, the blankets nailed over upstairs windows. He described the drawings on the walls, trees of lineage, sketches of bodies, and how neatness can turn to harm when it refuses to admit blood. Then he told them about the cellar. He did not change his voice. He did not lean forward to force belief. He spoke as if reading a weather report he hated. A narrow passage, slits cut high, rings sunk into joists, grooves rubbed into wood by ties that outlasted daylight. He spoke of the boy in the first stall, the girl in the second, the empty third with its tally marks, the fourth with the blanket no one lifted twice. He told them how the air changed each time a latch gave, as if a room relieved itself of a secret. He finished with a sentence that sounded simple until its weight landed. The house had trained itself to be a glove for cruelty. The defense stood and asked whether Red had formed these impressions before or after he learned about the missing hunter and the missing doctor. Red said the impressions were made by rooms, not stories. The defense asked if he had ever seen such a cellar used for food storage in flood country. He said he had. Then he looked at the jurors and added that potatoes do not count the days by carving into wood. The judge allowed the line to stand. Juries like sentences that stick. Caldwell from the Mercantile followed, ledger in hand. He read dates and items with the rhythm of a man who had lived his life by numbers. Lime in sacks, rope by the coil, boards, jars, flour, carbolic tonic, more boards. The defense suggested that any farm might require such things. Caldwell said true, 1 coil, 2 coils, sometimes 3, but these were patterns that braided, not needs that passed. He placed the page open on the rail. The jurors leaned to see who had signed. The 2 signatures slanted the same way and crossed the T in the same place. Caldwell said he had thought it odd, and then had thought again because business teaches you when to stop thinking. The surveyor described the exterior. A bulkhead added in 1912, hinges changed in 1915, extra boards on windows in 1916, a door repaired twice in 1 year where no weather could have struck it. He did not guess. He measured. He set down numbers with the same care he used when a fence line might save a neighbor from a fight. The pastor's wife testified to a smaller thing that felt larger. She said Dr. Marion LeClaire had stood on her porch and said she needed one last look with her own eyes before she fetched the sheriff, so the man could not dismiss her as a gossip. She described the doctor's bag, the curve of the brass latch, the way the doctor's hand had squeezed hers as if time had been peeled too thin. When the state handed her the leather bag with ML on the handle, she pressed her palm to the initials and swallowed once. The defense called its expert, a physician from Missoula with spectacles like small windows and a vocabulary smooth as a riverstone. He spoke about mirrored minds and shared delusion, about how isolation can bend two saplings toward each other until they grow as one trunk. He used words that could house many meanings: dissociation, folie à deux, and built a bridge from the twins' politeness to a place where culpability thins. The jurors listened with their eyes narrowed the way people narrow eyes at a horizon when weather is deciding what to do. The state attorney did not argue with the expert's vocabulary. He simply placed one of the notebooks on the rail and asked the physician to read an ordinary day's entry into the record. The physician read, S1 rattling breath, exposure increased by quarter hour. Specimen quieter after withholding. Note skull asymmetry persists. S2 baseline. S3 non-viable. Variables insufficiently controlled for improved outcome. The physician stopped halfway through the page, then gathered himself and finished. The attorney thanked him politely and sat down. The expert folded his hands and said nothing more persuasive for the rest of the day, because any mouth after such letters must taste of ash. Amos took the stand. He swore with his palm flat as a board. He answered many questions with care and said as little as a person can say while still pretending to answer. He said the rings in the joists were for storms. He said the boards over the windows managed light for sleepers. He said the stalls were storage. He said the letters kept feelings from deforming the record. The attorney asked him what he felt when a child died. Amos said he felt the disappointment of a terminated line and the duty to learn from it. He spoke as if the words had been practiced, and they had against a wall at night without answer. The jurors did not shift in their seats to get comfortable. They held themselves as if a piece of ice rested on the small of each back. Lena took the stand the next morning. She smiled only once at a question that could have been read as praise for neatness. She called the children subjects without realizing the room heard the decision buried inside the word. The attorney asked her if she had ever held S1 simply to hold her. Lena said the observation would have been contaminated by comfort. When he asked if she had named any of them, she said names are variables. He did not ask her to say the names they had refused. He looked at the jurors instead. The judge allowed the notebooks to be entered in full. The clerk read samples aloud so the words would live beyond ink. Reduced intake, observe responsiveness. Light exposure increased by quarter hour. S2 displays low effect. Isolate for further evaluation. Improved cranial profile. Not every line breathes true. In a rustle that was not quite a sound, the jurors looked down at their hands because hands sometimes twitch toward weapons when the mouth cannot shape what it wants to throw. When the state rested, the defense tried one last turn. That law required proof of mind at the time of the act. They painted a picture of two young people in a hard valley, motherless, steeped in wrong books, deaf to any voice but the others. They said storms and silence had written on their minds. They said the twins were instruments played by the place. The attorney for the state stood and let the silence stretch so the defense would hear its own echo, then said that instruments can be laid down, and that at any step a hand may reach for a latch and lift. He asked the jurors to remember the tally marks that stopped mid-line and decide whether the law should finish them. Closing arguments passed like weather. The defense pointed at the valley and history. The state pointed at stalls and words. The judge instructed the jury and set them to their work. They stood and filed out to a room with a table and a water pitcher and a single window that watched a bit of sky. The courthouse emptied its breath. In the hallway, the pastor's wife sat with her chin high and her hands moist, and Caldwell folded and unfolded a piece of paper until it tore in two. Red leaned against a wall with his hat in his hands and studied his boots as if they might answer whether he had waited too long. A clerk wrote the date in a book and inked it twice as if adding can make a line darker. The jurors returned before the clock could lie to them about how much time had passed. They did not look at the twins. The foreman did not clear his throat because the words had been ready since a stall door opened under a crowbar. Guilty on murder. Guilty on unlawful imprisonment. Guilty on aggravated abuse. Guilty on conspiracy. Guilty in the plain way a room is guilty when it is built for harm. The judge's voice did not lift for the sentence. Life for each in separate confinement, the only mercy allowed being that the law had none left to offer. They were led from the room in opposite directions, not because anyone feared an embrace, but because habit is a rope. They did not reach for each other. They did not call each other's names. They had none. On the platform, when the railcar door slid open, Lena asked whether the subjects would be maintained on schedule. The deputy told her the children were being called by names and would be fed when hungry, and wrapped when cold and spoken to even when they could not answer. Amos asked whether any new variables would be introduced. The deputy said the only variables now were patience and time. The penitentiary sat on a dry hill where wind worried the grass bare. The warden believed in rules because rules saved him from thinking too long about the weight of keys. Amos was placed in a cell on the east block, Lena on the west, each in a row where the other's breath could never be carried by chance. They asked for paper. They were refused. They asked for books. They were given a Bible and a manual for farm management without pictures. They asked for each other. The warden laughed in a way that had no humor in it and said the valley had had quite enough of that. Days found their shape without being asked. Wake, count. Work, count. Sleep, count. Amos stacked bricks and recorded measurements of mortar gaps in his head. Lena worked in the infirmary sorting bandages by size and counted each bundle twice. When a nurse asked her to carry water to a woman keening for a boy fallen from a scaffold, Lena paused and then did the task with the same steady hands she had once used to lay a blanket over a small form. She did not speak to the woman. The nurse did. Back in the valley, the children learned names given to them by the doctor and the women who sat through nights. The oldest answered to Laurel. The boy liked Jonah because the sound rounded like a cup. The small one smiled without showing teeth when somebody said Wren. Names worked on them like fences, not to pen them in, but to keep certain things out. Laurel learned the sound of the nurse's approach and stilled only a little. Jonah tapped less and watched more. Wren slept without the quilt tent once and woke in amazement that the world still held her. Ephraim lay under a window at the asylum where the light did not swing. He spoke to the rafters as if they needed instruction, that numbers are not language, that a door is not love if it latches the wrong way, that a child is not a variable even when two people write it so. The attendant wrote some of this down without understanding why his hand felt steadier for it. When Ephraim slept, his fingers moved, counting a thing he no longer had to count. The lodge stood empty under the spruce while the case finished making its shape in the newspapers. Men working the road took the long bend around the spur rather than walk past the turnoff. Dogs laid down and whined without being told why. The sheriff visited once more with the county attorney to collect what paper could be taken and to board the cellar door with screws only a square driver could remove. He took 2 iron rings and handed one to the attorney. "Keep it," he said. "It is easier to forget than to remember, and easier to remember the wrong thing than the right." The attorney dropped the ring into a drawer and closed it too hard. Time, which had been asked to stand still while a town learned how to say a new kind of sentence, resumed its ordinary habit of not caring. Snow retreated up gulches, the creek lowered, the mill wheel turned. Women came to the infirmary with mending and sat and taught Jonah how to push a wooden car across a floor without collapse. Laurel learned that a window holds and does not fall forward. Wren traced the seams of quilts with a fingertip and made them into rivers that always found a way out of corners. The doctor wrote small victories in a ledger with the tenderness she reserved for births. A letter came to the sheriff from a family 3 counties north, asking whether a hunter who liked to whistle through his front teeth had ever been found. Red folded the letter and did not write yet. He walked to the creek and found a place where the water thinned enough to show the rock. He said the man's name aloud to be certain it existed and told the water that he owed this family a truth he might never be able to give. Then he went back to his desk and wrote a letter that said, "Not yet," and that he was still looking and that sometimes absence does not mean nothing, it means a story that refuses to show its body. At the prison, nights wore grooves in the twins. The warden listened for knocking across blocks and heard none. Sometimes a guard swore he had seen Amos turn his head to listen to something nobody else could hear, and sometimes another said he had watched Lena lift her hand and lower it without knocking. The warden wrote each report down and then laughed at himself for writing it. He slept better when the pages were full. The judge's final orders arrived with the precision of a clock that had been waiting to strike. The twins would not be paroled. No petition would be entertained for 10 years, then another 10. The order carried a line that was not typical of such documents. The court takes judicial notice that vocabulary shall not obscure meaning. Red read it twice and put it in the same drawer as the iron ring. He thought of the 3rd stall and the hatch marks that did not finish. Then sharpened his pencil and wrote a note for himself. Knock anyhow. In Blackwater Crossing, the bell rope was spliced where it had frayed. On a clear Sunday, the pastor pulled once, and the sound carried into the hills clean as water poured from a bucket. A child at the back tapped twice on the pew. His mother left his hand where it lay and squeezed it once in time with the echo. Outside, the creek talked about nothing but its own journey. People stood in the sun longer than they needed to, and did not look up the road toward the lodge, and did not speak loudly in case the air was still learning how to listen to kinder things. The trial ended like a storm that has rained itself empty, and the valley tried to stand back up as if weather were something a spine could resist. Wagons returned to their ruts, saws started. The creek, which had seemed to carry other people's voices for weeks, returned to talking only about stones and fish. The newspapers ran out of new sentences and began repeating their old ones. The twins vanished into the penitentiary the way a thrown stone disappears into deep water, leaving only rings that took a while to fade. Red delivered the iron ring to the attorney and kept its twin in his desk. Some nights he pressed the metal to his palm to remember the weight of a cellar rather than the softness of rumor. He went back to the lodge twice a month with a deputy or alone, boarded the cellar door with more screws than the board strictly required, and walked the yard to see where the ground changed color when it rained. He did not expect revelation. He expected persistence. Some truths yield in a rush. Some pry loose only when a hand returns often enough to teach the seam its own weakness. In the infirmary 1 county over, the children learned the geography of gentleness. Laurel stood beside the north window each morning with her palm flat on the wall to feel the building breathe. When wagons rattled past in the street below, she watched the curtain's hem tremble and did not flinch. Jonah learned to push a wooden car across the floor and not collapse when the wheels snagged at a crack. He would stop, lift, set, and go on, laughing once when the nurse made the same sound his wheels made. Wren practiced trust by letting the quilt fall over her face and then pulling it down slowly to find the room still where she had left it. The doctor wrote these things in a ledger as if recording the slow eruption of a spring. Great, here's your passage rewritten as a clean cinematic YouTube narration around 2,000 words. Keeping the same plot beats, tone, and imagery while tightening flow and pacing. No headings or timestamps, just straight VO ready prose. Spring pride at the valley until the ground gave way, and flood came early in 1918. Blackwater Creek fattened with snowmelt and ran brown and loud, scraping the banks as if it meant to erase the year. On the second day, a slab of earth slumped below the old lodge and revealed what careful hands had hidden years before. Sheriff Red roped himself and 2 men to a cedar stump and edged along the crumble with their spades. They did not find a whole truth. Truth rarely comes whole in this country, but they did find a button still on a rag of canvas, 2 human teeth packed in chalky lime, and a bent piece of a spectacle frame whose curve no man could mistake. The pastor's wife pressed her palm to her mouth and whispered the doctor's name. Red wrapped the remnants in clean muslin, labeled them without pretending they were bodies, and wrote 2 letters. One to a brother who hadn't stopped praying, one to a hunter's sister who still set a tin cup on her porch rail on days when the sky matched memory. The creek had done what men could not, and the valley had given back what it never should have been asked to keep. That autumn, Ephraim Vale died with one hand resting on a windowsill as if testing the temperature of a better room. The attendant said he went quiet, spoke 2 simple words, door open and let go. The town buried him beside Agnes where the ground drains well. Red stood with his hat against his chest and looked over the wooden markers, thinking how many lives had worn their knuckles raw on doors that opened too late or never. After the prayer, he walked alone to the creek, dropped an unlit cigarette on the water and watched it float, roll, and sink. Life at the penitentiary ran on square wheels. Amos lifted brick, counted, stacked, and told time by the way mortar skinned over in dry air. When he spoke to guards, he asked about schedules and measurements, as though only nouns with numbers deserved breath. He never asked for the yard or the sky. Lena learned the infirmary's habits and made herself useful with tasks that did not require gentleness. She folded bandages with the kind of precision that feels like piety when a person has nothing else to worship. A yellow cat drifted into the ward and slept in a laundry basket. She shooed it without touching its head. The warden said she was the sort who would straighten a picture on a burning wall. Letters came from people who wanted to see monsters. The warden sent them back unanswered. One evening at Switch, passing between the blocks, he thought he heard a faint double knock, polite, like a knuckle testing the world. He stopped and listened. Nothing. Wind can mimic anything if a man permits it, he told himself and walked on with his keys. Back in Blackwater Crossing, the lodge sagged. A shingle lifted here, a sill rotted there. Boys dared each other to run to the porch at dusk and touch the rail. Girls dared each other to stand at the bend and not blink. Red kept the cellar boarded because boarded doors teach a different lesson than doors left ajar. 2 summers later, lightning struck the chimney in a dry storm. Roof and rafters took at once and glowed for hours, as if the notebooks inside had finally learned to burn without ink. People gathered in the road and watched with their hands at their sides. No one brought buckets. No one wanted to live in a valley where that house could be put back up. When Red arrived, the fire was speaking only in embers. He stood at the heat's edge and did not say good riddance because good has nothing to do with riddance. Did not say finally because final is a coward's word. He said nothing and let the flames do the one honest thing they can do: end a shape. Daylight revealed a single chimney and a scatter of half-melted hardware. In the ash, the cellar mouth lay as a black rectangle, untouched as if the fire had been refused admission. Heat does strange algebra. Sometimes the hottest thing survives. Red peered down long enough to make sure no ember hid in straw, then sealed the opening with stone so heavy a memory would think twice before trying. Years widened. The county attorney married gray at the temples and moved to the capital. Caldwell sold the mercantile to a nephew with better penmanship and worse patience. The pastor's wife taught Wren how to shell peas by pinching the seam with a thumb and sliding the pearls into a bowl. One early spring, when the air couldn't decide which season it belonged to, Wren's lungs failed. She went easily, the doctor said, which is what doctors say when their hands have done everything hands can do and it still isn't enough. The nurse laid the child's quilt, the one that had been a tent, across her hips and smoothed it twice, as if smoothing could teach peace to stay. The pastor wrote her name in the infirmary ledger and stained his fingers with ink. Jonah grew into a quiet man with a cooper's knife. He shaved staves smooth while whistling the two-note tune a nurse had once used to pull laughter out of him like a coin from behind the ear. When customers asked for a barrel, he looked up long enough to gauge the order and answer with a word or two, the way a person speaks when the past built his voice a smaller room. He lived in a boarding house with a window over a lane and kept habits that made the world predictable. Oatmeal, work, walk, wash, sleep. If rain surprised him, he stepped into a doorway and waited for the sky to remember itself. When people asked his last name, he said Vale, then shook his head and added that the doctor told him to keep the name the law gave and let the river do the forgetting. Laurel remained in care and learned to read faces like weather. She could see a voice about to break and stepped close to lay her fingers lightly on a forearm until the throe passed. When the infirmary clock chimed, she didn't count the strokes. She smiled because certain sounds returning is a kind of mercy. On kind mornings, she sat by the north window naming clouds. This one a feather, this one a milk spill, this one a door. Once she touched the glass and said cellar, shook her head and said no. Sky. The nurse kissed the back of her hand. The penitentiary wrote deaths in ink that looks the same for saints and sinners. In 1931, Amos's heart forgot its job. His belongings fit in an envelope. A Bible creased at Exodus, a length of string, a pencil gnawed too short to hold, a slip of paper marked in neat hatch strokes as if time could be taught to behave. Lena lasted longer. She sickened in winter and refused to lie down until a nurse said she'd spill the basins if she kept walking. Near the end, she asked if the subjects had continued to improve. The nurse said the children had learned their names, then looked away so pity wouldn't be mistaken for conversation. Lena died with her eyes on a ceiling without cracks. The warden signed the form and walked into wind that chapped his face painful and clean. The story became other people's stories, the way water finds a new channel and leaves old pools still. Parents told their children, if you hear a noise where no noise should be, knock and keep knocking and fetch someone to knock with you. Teachers said names matter, that words can carry harm as neatly as a bucket carries water, and recognizing the bucket is not the same as drinking. The bell rang and did not break. Grass grew in the road's ruts. The black mouth of the cellar under stone became a shape only people who had lifted those stones could trace in the air. Red aged on his feet and taught younger deputies to keep their ears open and their mouths closed when a story smelled wrong. Asked how to tell when a house is lying, he said listen for the almost sound. A hum behind a door that should open easy and doesn't. He kept one iron ring from the cellar. Some winters he set it on the stove, warmed it, and pressed it into his palm to remind himself that iron remembers heat. And men forget too easily. A new courthouse clerk came from the east and wanted records to stand straight. He found a line in the judge's order, "Vocabulary shall not obscure meaning," framed it above his desk and pointed whenever a neat phrase tried to smuggle harm past sense. Schoolboys snickered at the long words until he told them those were the only ones keeping the rest from lying. The pastor borrowed the sentence for a sermon about naming as the smallest door we open for each other. On the 10th anniversary of the verdict, the infirmary planted a maple near the north wall for Wren. Jonah stood hat in hand, mouth moving as if reminding itself how, and said thank you to no one and everyone. Laurel watched leaves and traced their shade with a fingertip on the sill. The doctor, older and bent, read the children's names aloud and said a ledger that writes the living and the dead with equal care is the best work a town can do. Another flood shaved a slice of the old yard into the creek. Boys scavenged a rusted hinge and 2 square nails and sold them to a tinker for a penny. No more bones surfaced. Red wrote no more letters. He retired the year his hands shook buttoning cuffs. On his last day, he took the iron ring from his drawer, turned it once, and carried it to the river path. He didn't throw it in. He set it beneath a flat stone where grass grows thin from being useful. He figured the next man who needed it would stop there without knowing why, lift the stone, and understand enough. In the years that followed, the tale shed the parts told for entertainment and kept the parts that hurt enough to be useful. It lost names it never needed and learned some it had forgotten. It remained in the bell rope's fibers, in the pastor's line about doors, in the doctor's ledger, in the maple's shade, in a cooper's soft laugh, in a nurse's habit of tapping twice out of love and never to command. It lived in the bedtime instruction passed to children. If you hear someone counting where no one should be, go stand with them, count to the door, and make the door open. Eventually, the chimney fell in a west wind and the stones tumbled with the soft percussion of an old song ending. Nothing rose in its place. Ferns colonized damp hollows. A wren stitched a nest where soot had whispered. In drought, the dark rectangle of the buried cellar showed through the grass like a shadow pretending to be depth. Travelers who didn't know the story felt uneasy there and walked faster without understanding why. That was the point. Not to forget, and not to be ruled by memory, only to keep a hand ready for a latch. On the last afternoon, Red climbed the hill and leaned against the chimney's remaining stones, warm with stored noon. He told the air a simple truth. Names are fences. Fences do not imprison when built to keep harm out. Any hand can build one by writing a name where a letter used to be. He knocked once on the brick because knocking had saved souls in this valley. The sound went into emptiness and came back plain. He walked away without looking back. The creek talked in its old voice. The valley listened. And the road did what roads are made to do. Carried people past a place that taught them how to see. If stories like this move you, subscribe and turn on the bell so the next time a door opens in the dark, you'll hear it too. Share this with someone who trusts history more when it refuses to lie. We remember because forgetting never saved a child. We listen because silence never opened a latch. Until the next time we walk to the edge of a hard truth together, take care of your doors and the names on them.